Well, it's another eventful Friday in the campaign, and with 10 days to go, this Thanksgiving weekend is very important. Let's bring in three colleagues from the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Mia Rabson is a parliamentary correspondent with the Canadian Press. Bob Fife, Parliamentary Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and Alex Ballingall is a parliamentary reporter with the Toronto Star. Good to see you all.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. Let me start with the party platforms. Let's start there today. And we have the Conservative platform, costed. We have the NDP platform, which has been out but now costed. So, Mia, let me start with you. When you look at the Conservative platform, I mean, do viewers have clearly something to pick from here in terms of what the parties are offering?
Maybe not from the platforms itself. I mean, there are some things that distinguish them, particularly on climate change is one particular issue. I mean, for example, the Conservatives and the Liberals both offering tax cuts in different ways, but that add up to sort of similar dollars in the end. So on that front, not necessarily, but it's about the deficits. The Conservatives say they will be back into balance in 5 years.
Yeah, by putting off infrastructure projects and by taking on the public service.
The question, of course, is how much of that can you believe? A lot of it is sort of in the other category. We're going to find, we're going to make government be better, be tighter. I think, suggested, public servants might actually have to sit in smaller cubicles, like save money.
Selling off 30% of the government real estate.
There's one that's just about
smaller footprint, freezing the public service.
Repealing some measures from Budget 2019, but doesn't actually say what measures from Budget 2019. So there is definitely a lot of sort of questions about how these numbers are actually going to work. But on paper, the Conservatives do say they will get back to balance. And of course, none of the other parties actually have a balance within the 5 years.
Right. What did you see in this platform today, Alex?
The thing that jumped out at me was I was hoping to see a bit more answers around how their climate plan is going to work, specifically around their measure to force heavy emitters to pay a certain amount.
Right.
They still haven't said exactly how that's going to work, and I feel like that's a major piece of how they would give candidates best chance to achieve the Paris targets. And I think there's still a lot of question marks around how they would actually reduce emissions with this plan.
What questions do you have after seeing
Well,
this plan?
all of the platforms, we shouldn't put any money on them as being true at all. The Liberals one, forget it. The NDP one, they're spending $30 billion a year, $130 billion over 4 years. Nobody can afford that. And the Conservative plan, where they're going to balance the budget by all these kind of cuts, and some of them are mystery cuts. We don't know anything about them. So I don't think voters should pay a lot of attention to that. The issue, and I think it's, in some ways, Peter, I think it's too late for people to really be thinking about, whether this platform is costed or not.
Right.
Now people are getting to the crunch time. Who do I think is best going to be the best leader to run the country? And that we don't know yet. It looks like the Liberals are going to squeak by with a minority, but my God, it's going to be a close one.
And we've seen a lot of, just in the last 48 hours, we've seen the ground change, and I think we might see it change some more, and largely, Mia, because of this surge that we're seeing in the province of Quebec by the Bloc Québécois, eating into Liberal support, eating into Conservative support. It was probably already eating into NDP support, but suddenly it's changed all of the calculations about possibilities here and who might end up in the Prime Minister's chair at the end of the night on October 21st, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. I mean, the Bloc sort of first came for the NDP voters. The NDP was doing very poorly in Quebec, even leading into the election. Most of that it was going to the Bloc. And then after the TVA debate last week, Andrew Scheer had a very weak performance there, had some comments, particularly about social issues like abortion, and his numbers just started to tank in Quebec. And then I saw, it was sort of a funny tweet. They said, okay, now they've come for the Conservatives. Liberals, they're coming for your votes next. And that is exactly what is starting to happen.
And normally what happens historically in the province of Quebec, if you look at over past elections, that's kind of what happens. When the Bloc is on the rise, it typically eats into Conservative support, and if it keeps going, then it starts eating into Liberal support. What do you think is driving this narrative, Alex? That suddenly they're sort of back in the game in a big way.
I think a lot of it is the performance of Blanchette at the debates. I think he's done quite well. I think also sort of an issue like Bill 21, having the federal leader sort of trying to straddle an uncomfortable position on that, and then having Blanchette just be able to be like the defender of Quebec values blatantly. I think maybe that has helped the dynamic, but beyond, I honestly don't. I don't have the full understanding all the time.
Look, I think a lot of this lands on Mr. Trudeau's table. I mean, let's face this. He should have a commanding lead in Quebec, and he did actually originally. because he's a Quebecer, and they tend to rally around their own, as they've seen with Brian Mulroney, and we saw it with his father, Pierre Trudeau, and we saw it even with Chrétien. In the worst periods of the time, Chrétien kept increasing his vote in Quebec. But Mr. Trudeau's got a problem here, and I think it's one we're starting to see happen across the country. We saw it, it's there very significantly in Western Canada. It now seems to be a problem in British Columbia, where it looks like a pretty tough three-way race there. And he did very well coming out of British Columbia in 2015. Ontario now is the place where it may save Mr. Trudeau's bacon, because it's not going to be Quebec now. We all thought that after Atlantic Canada, he'd lose some seats in Atlantic Canada, but he'd sweep through Quebec. And then he'd
any losses he was going to have in other parts of the country, he was going to be able to make up for in Quebec and Ontario.
That doesn't
seem to be the case now.
Both him and the Tory.
And so, people are questioning Mr. Scheer's leadership if he doesn't win, but maybe some Liberals should start questioning Mr. Trudeau's leadership, because it's very, very rare when you win a big majority government that you don't come back with another majority.
And the two things that are facing Trudeau elsewhere in the country that are dogging him the most, SNC-Lavalin and the blackface issue, not really a big issue in Quebec. So the question, of course, then is, well, what is facing him in Quebec? And it may just be
What's environment?
It's the environment, and not really that inspiring to people right now. And it's sort of like nobody wants any of the leaders.
And I wonder how much of it is that we didn't start to see this shift until people got to see Yves-François Blanchet perform in the debates, right? And make this case that, look,
he's a great performer.
He's also, we now have three parties in the election, pushing this narrative that, it's going to be a minority parliament, so just vote for whoever you want. We might get better things in a minority parliament than we can get if either two of these parties, Liberal or Conservative, are actually in charge. So make the choices you want. He's really hammering that hard. And I'm wondering if that's starting to convince, those Quebec voters who've said, he's right, it's going to be a minority parliament, so I do want someone who's looking after Quebec. I'm voting Bloc.
Quebec also has this tendency to move in blocks. To sort of use a very bad pun.
Small B blocks.
Small B blocks. They went to they swept to the NDP, and provincially they swept to the Coalition Avenir Quebec, and now it looks like they're moving back. They have this tendency in Quebec to, when things start to move, they move big in one direction, and it's hard to stop that freight train. So the Liberals, if they want to hang on to this, they got a big job to do in the next 10 days.
The other thing is that they have a problem. This used to work successfully for the Liberals when they were in tight races with the Conservatives. They were able to say, if you don't progress us, if you don't come to us, the Conservatives are going to win a majority government, and we're going to be in trouble because they don't share those values. Well, that's not the case now, is it? Because it's clear that Mr. Scheer's Conservatives are not going to win a majority government, and it doesn't even look like they're close to maybe even winning a minority at this particular point. So it's safer for people to say, okay, well, the Liberals are going to win a minority, but I'm going to support my candidate.
That's interesting. NDP platform out today, costed. The rest of it out today, and Bob touched on it. I mean, it's all hinging on hiking corporate tax cuts, capital gains. It's really sort of aimed at wealthier Canadians and making them pay the freight. Is there anything we didn't know here?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's a lot of big ticket items in there. $10 billion for universal child care, $10 billion for pharmacare. These are huge spending programs and things that a lot of Canadians might be a bit nervous about the idea of how much these programs are costing, and are they really realistic that we can roll these especially because neither of those programs can you do without the provinces.
And cost uncertainty around these is pointed out by the Parliamentary Budget Office.
Yeah, especially around the new super wealth tax and sort of the ones that we haven't seen in Canada before. I guess the behavioral response of the super rich that would pay it, when they had the money and split it around.
Jagmeet Singh said today when asked about that, what they'll just go out and hire accountants and they'll find ways to avoid paying. He said, well, that's why we only made it 1%. Because we figure if we only make it 1%, they'll just look at the 1% and go, it'll cost me as much to get accountants to fight it, I'll just pay it.
It is 1% per year, though, I guess. So I would say
it
would be 1% every year. So maybe it would end up, maybe not 1 year, it wouldn't be worth it.
It must be nice to be confronted with that dilemma, Bob. How much money? So am I going to waste this on accountants or just pay it and just send it out the door?
There was a former head of EY, which is a major chartered accountant firm, said, look, we pay our best guys $700,000 a year, and Revenue Canada pays them maybe $100,000. Who do you think is going to win in this one? Now, if they were smart enough to hire our guys and pay them $700,000 a year, the government would have a pile of money.
Yeah. Let's finish up a couple quick things before we do. So why is there talk about any speculation? Bob, you've written about this, about Andrew Scheer's leadership, even before we get the vote.
Well, this was his best, Conservatives' best time. Mr. Trudeau headed into this election wounded by SNC-Lavalin. The blackface hurt him. He hasn't performed all that well in the campaign, and people are questioning his authenticity. And here you have a chance, or at least many Conservatives think that this is a chance where they could have beaten him. And he hasn't been able to grow the Conservative vote, and he hasn't
How do they think
he hasn't performed well.
How do they think he's like what do they think he's not done? Like where has he missed? Has he missed? Has he missed in Quebec?
Well, look, dual citizenship.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a classic example.
That was a gimme.
Well, you didn't get ahead of this? Are you crazy? And then he says, well, nobody asked me the question. He didn't get ahead of the fact that he wasn't an insurance broker that he claimed for 15 years or so. I mean, this is Mickey Mouse stuff that should have, amateur stuff that should have been dealt with before the election campaign.
And it took him about 6 weeks to finally be clear on his personal stance on abortion. And that's what I'm hearing from a lot of Conservatives that was really frustrating to them, because the Liberals do this constantly. They're always saying, you know, they're going to reopen the abortion debate. They should have seen this coming for 3 years.
So you can go through. You can go through this for 4 hours, or you can go through it for 10 days, right?
And so they've been very frustrated about how long it took and how long sort of the leash that they were able to get the Liberals on this. But then I've also heard people mention that the citizenship thing is really bothering them. They're like, you knew last winter when SNC was happening that you could be the Prime Minister. You knew it was becoming more realistic, and you still didn't do anything about it until August, and you didn't tell anyone. There's a lot of frustration amongst Conservatives.
Thanksgiving weekend, what are you watching for, Alex? After this, I mean, this is supposed to be, whether it's true or not, this is when everybody gets together and families get together and talk about turkey. A lot of families just get together and fight at Thanksgiving, but apparently, maybe that's our family. Yeah. Maybe it'll be over
Looking
politics.
forward to that, first of all, yeah.
So, I mean, are we watching to see if this weekend moves stuff? And,
I think we were sort of talking about it before the show. The NDP, like if there's movement there, if we do have this sort of minority, most likely scenario, will progressive voters then move to the NDP and feel more comfortable not voting?
If they're deciding the
strategically?
bloc's okay in a minority parliament, let's start.
Maybe do it. Maybe in the rest of Canada could go NDP,
or the Greens,
or even Quebec. So movement there, I think, would be one thing I'd watch for over the next few days.
What do you think?
I'm absolutely going to be glued to the polls coming Tuesday and Wednesday. Wednesday will probably have a really good idea if this election is firming up and who is likely to form a minority government. We usually by this stretch of the campaign, we should be starting to have a good idea. And we'll also see where right now the percentage of undecided is about 14%. That should drop by midweek.
Yeah, I think this is about the time in the last election where that Liberal push really started to be apparent. You started to see it going into the Thanksgiving weekend. And so I'm just sort of watching to see what the parties have in store for their announcements are done. They really don't have any more promises to put on the table.
It's all about
so now it's about hammering it home
and
do their messages change. We saw the Conservatives go a bit more negative this week, for example.
All right. Thank you all. We'll talk again.
Thank you.
Thank you.